I hope everyone is doing well. Well, I just have to really switch on the aircon because I'm boiling. Sorry about that. So I hope everyone is doing well. Today we are going to be talking about those pesky retrograde planets because there are loads of questions coming to me about retrograde planets, as well as I can see many posts on certain type of social media groups asking about, oh, my days, I was born during Saturn retrograde. So what does that mean for me? Saturn is placed in my fifth house, for example, and so forth. So maybe we need to talk about the retrograde planets a little bit, okay? And I'm going to be very statistical today. So welcome back, everyone. My name is AstroViktor. If you are new to my channel, thank you for being here. Make sure you subscribe, as well as like the video, or let me know how many retrograde planets you have. And if you have been following me, then thank you very much for being a supporter. But today we need to dismantle one of these biggest sources of unnecessary fear in astrology, or the astrological chart interpretation, and those are the natal retrograde planets. Almost daily, I get comments or messages from people, obviously looking at their charts, and then they are kind of like panicking. Oh, I have 4 retrograde planets. Is my chart or life ruined? I was born during a Saturn retrograde. Does that mean my career is permanently blocked? I've got Venus in my 7th house being retrograde. Does that mean I'm never going to find love? Or Neptune is retrograde in my chart. Am I doomed to be deluded? All these type of questions. And, I'm just wondering, do you have these questions yourself as well? How many retrograde planets do you have? Because these questions are, very typical nowadays. Of course, we are in the world of internet, and that tends to be conditioning us, right? Often we are conditioned to view retrograde symbols kind of like as a red flag, or kind of like a bit of a cosmic malfunction. Whenever Mercury or Venus turns around in the sky, social media treats it like an emergency. And when people discover these symbols in their own natal blueprint, that anxiety gets turned inward. It burns into our subconscious. So I would like to lift that out of your subconscious today, okay? Because how many times do you read that, oh, it's Mercury retrograde, do not sign any contract, do not buy this, do not do that, or with Venus retrograde, your ex is going to come back to you, and all these type of sentences, these get burned into your subconscious mind. So today we are going to look at the hard astronomical numbers. We will review the actual population data to show you that being born with retrograde planets is not a personal failure. It is the baseline of human experience. In fact, if you want to find the real statistical kind of like oddity, it's not having, let's say, 4 retrograde planets in your chart, it's having 0. So that would be interesting. So what we are going to be covering in this video is the exact mathematical percentages of every single planet's retrograde frequency, the population distribution of total retrogrades per chart, the psychology of all direct chart versus multiple retrogrades, and how to actually integrate and interpret these mechanics in practice. And our example today is going to be in the name of Venus. So we are going to be looking at a few examples connected to Venus retrograde in the sign of Scorpio, because that's about to come up very shortly, right? Before we dive into that data tables, a quick reminder that we are running our official end of summer promotion. So you can get 30% off on all personal consultations and readings. And you can also apply this 30% discount to my yearly academy membership as well. So you need to use the promo code BYSUMMER, all capital, at the checkout. And this special pricing is valid only through September 5th. So if you want to look at your specific chart rulers, your transit activations, or you want to join our community for very structured masterclasses, make sure to grab this yearly membership program before the promotion wraps up on September 5th. All links are going to be in the description box below. So, but let's look at why retrogrades exist geocentrically and what the global percentage looks like. So when we observe planets from Earth, outer planets move slower than us, and the inner planets move faster. Because of our relative orbital speeds, every celestial body outside of the sun and the moon must appear to move backwards for a specific percentage of time each cycle. So, for example, when we look at the generational planets, Pluto retrogrades roughly 160 to 165 days every single year. This means 44 to 45% of the human population has Pluto retrograde. Neptune retrogrades about 160 days each year. There is approximately 43 to 44% of everyone on Earth. Uranus retrogrades around 150 days each year, so that covers 40 to 42% of the population. So when someone worries that their Pluto or Neptune is retrograde, you are worrying about a placement shared by nearly half the planet. Unless an outer planet is sitting directly on the ascendant degree or tightly aspecting a personal planet within 1 degree, or tightly aspecting your ascendant, for example, or any of your angles in the chart, its retrograde status simply just reflects standard generational background motion. Now, when we look at the social planets are Saturn and Jupiter, and they are pretty much the representation of society. So Saturn retrogrades for roughly about 140 days a year. So that's about 4.5 months, right? So approximately 36 to 38% of all charts carry Saturn retrograde. Jupiter retrogrades for about 120 days a year. That's about 4 months, right? So roughly 30 to 33% of people are born with Jupiter retrograde. So more than 1 in 3 people on Earth has Saturn or Jupiter retrograde. It is not an uncommon curse. It simply turns social structures, ethics, and authority inward for a bit of a personal re-evaluation. And I'm going to be describing to you what retrograde planets also mean. So just stay till the very end of the video, because most likely you're going to gain a lot out of this. Now, when the personal planets, such as Mercury, Mars, and Venus go retrograde, now those could be somewhat interesting, okay? Because Mercury retrogrades 3-4 times a year for about 3 weeks at a time. So that puts Mercury retrograde in 18 to 20 of all birth charts, roughly 1 in every 5 people. So that's also not something that is uncommon. Mars retrogrades once every 26-27 months for roughly about 82 days, which is a good 2.5 months. So only 9% to 10% of the population has natal Mars retrograde. So that's actually getting rarer, right? And when it comes to Venus, that's the rarest retrograde in astrology. Venus only retrogrades once every 18 months for about 40 to 44 days. So only 7 to 8% of people are born with Venus retrograde. So if you have Venus or Mars retrograde, I think you do have genuinely really unique individual signature. But if your retrogrades are Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto, I think you are just simply sharing standard critical mechanics with millions of people. So therefore, I'm not saying that you are not special if you have got Saturn retrograde, for example, in your chart, okay? Because something else can make your chart special. So let's just get that clear, because I don't want to get attacked that, how do you dare telling me that I'm not special? Everyone is special, okay? So now, when we look at the total kind of chart distribution, kind of like how many retrograde planets do you have in the chart, that's also actually super telling. So if you have 0 retrograde planets, what does it mean? All planets are direct in your chart. That's approximately about 6 to 7% of the population. So that's extremely rare. It means every single outer or personal planets was moving direct when you took your first breath. Or if you have got 1 retrograde planet, and I'm falling into that category, because Pluto is retrograde in my chart, that's about 18 to 20%. It's pretty uncommon as well, actually. Usually just 1 outer planet like Jupiter, Saturn, or Uranus, for example, or Neptune or Pluto is retrograde in your chart. 2 retrograde planets, 30 to 32% of the population have it. So that's going to be one of the most common statistical kind of like category there. 3 retrograde planets makes you fall into the group of 26 to 28%. So that's kind of like the second most common category. However, if you have got 4 retrograde planets, that's only 12 to 14% of the population experience that. So that's kind of moderately uncommon, right? Usually that's a mix of outer planets and 1 personal planet at least being retrograde. 5 retrograde planets, that's just 2 to 3% of the population. Very rare, super rare. It means that you are super unique. And if you have got 6 or more retrogrades, that's less than 0.5% of the population. So astronomically speaking, that is super rare. Super, 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 super rare. So let me ask you a question. How many retrogrades do you have in your chart? Do we have anyone in the group or on my Facebook channel who has got maybe 5 or 6 retrograde planets? And when I'm asking about planets, I'm not necessarily asking about the nodes, okay? So don't count the nodes. We are looking at only those planets that I have mentioned so far. So the 3 outer planets, Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus, 2 social planets, which would be Jupiter and Saturn. And then we are talking about the 3 personal planets, which is Mercury, Venus, and Mars. The Sun and the Moon never go retrograde. So let's just move a little bit further, right? Because, if you really add up the 2 retrograde and the 3 retrograde groups, then it means that over 55 to 60% of the entire human race has 2 or 3 retrograde planets. So let's just call having retrogrades is the standard operating system of the human unconscious, or not unconscious, consciousness, okay? Now, what does it mean psychologically or practically in your daily life, right? So a retrograde planet turns a bit the drive inwards. So, for example, direct Mercury. Direct Mercury speaks, then thinks. Retrograde Mercury thinks, filters, reviews, and then speaks. Or direct Mars attacks the problem head on, and the retrograde Mars strategizes, questions its own motives, internalizes drive before executing something. So retrogrades are kind of like providing these built-in internal brakes and a bit of a reflective capacity. So what's super rare here is when you have 0 retrogrades, right? So it means that you belong to that 6% minority group. So it means that you are kind of like operating without default internal brakes. So those people are always 1 step ahead, 1 foot in the future, right? It's a pure forward momentum. What you think, what you want, what you plan is immediately kind of like broadcast into the physical world. There is little analysis going on there, or those people rarely get paralyzed, for example. Maybe you learn through direct external kind of like trials and errors. And you learn from those. Or I think those people are also super good with kind of like deadlines or career demands or even the social pace. So they move forward with the world, basically. And because you lack that built-in kind of pause valves, so when transiting personal planets like Mercury or Mars goes retrograde, or we are going to be experiencing the Venusian retrograde in a very short time, and then it hits your chart, that's when life forces an unavoidable kind of like delay, and that's when things can feel a bit unbearable, right? Because your default response to kind of like a roadblock is to push harder rather than stepping back to reassess. So we can somehow say that the more retrograde planets you have, the less you feel the retrogrades in the sky as we speak. Now, if you have got 4+ retrograde charts, then I would call that as your life path not being non-linear, okay? So often those people do not measure progress by kind of like external milestones. Often they need more time to process experiences. Maybe you are reevaluating decisions repeatedly, and then you often find your greatest success later in life once kind of like that internal framework is solid and built up properly. So, when next time when you see someone kind of like online panicking about retrograde planets, maybe you just want to be sharing this video with them, or you want to be sharing the math with them. Because I don't think that retrogrades are cosmic punishments. I think they are often reflective mechanisms that allow human beings to develop self-awareness and questioning external conditioning and build kind of like individualized wisdom. If you happen to have an all direct chart, I think your lesson is simply learning how to install those kind of breaks in your life. Because as soon as a retrograde planet hits you, I think that could be way more painful for you. Right, so I would like you to share this information with fellow astrology enthusiasts just to help clear up the fear around retrogrades. And by the way, don't forget my end of summer sale is live until September 5th. So you can use the promo code by summer or capitals to save 30% on all my personal readings and yearly academy membership as well. But let's talk a little bit about Venus retrograde. Obviously, that is one of the most special ones, right? That happens only for about 6 to 7% of the population. So if you have Venus retrograde, I would say that your chart is pretty special if that's the only retrograde in your chart, okay? So because Venus only turns retrograde once every 18 months for about 40 to 44 days. So that's really uncommon. While direct Venus kind of readily absorbs and mirrors society's kind of like consensus on beauty, value, financial security, romantic etiquette. A retrograde Venus turns these evaluation kind of completely inward, or they tend to be looking at things slightly bit differently. Now, Venus is truly special. Over an 8-year period, Venus retrogrades 5 times, and it's tracing an almost perfect 5-pointed star when we connect the retrograde degrees. So for example, imagine that it goes retrograde in Scorpio, then it goes retrograde, let's say, in Leo. And then when I connect these dots, it's going to look like a beautiful pentagram. So when Venus is retrograde, it passes directly between the Earth and the Sun. So it's going to be making a so-called inferior conjunction. Also, you can call it as a cazimi. So this marks the transition of Venus from an evening star, which we also call as Hesperus, and often an evening star is going to be evaluating past experiences quite a lot, to a morning star, which we call Luciferian Venus, and that's pretty much about the new cycle of desire. So I'm going to break this down for you as well to understand the differences very shortly. But let's just talk about the Venus retrograde for a little while. So Venus is, of course, about value system, right? So when it's retrograde in your chart, you don't necessarily rely on like cultural or peer validation to decide what is attractive or meaningful or valuable. You know, their taste in art, fashion, aesthetics, lifestyle is usually quite individualized, often a little bit more nonconformist. Especially, let's say, if Venus is in the sign of Aquarius, or Venus is maybe out of bounds in your chart as well. Those are even going to be magnifying this further. Now, direct Venus assesses relational chemistry and social harmony way quicker. Retrograde Venus kind of processes these romantic and social bonds through an internal filter. So they usually take longer to fully open up emotionally. They need time to examine their feelings in isolation as well. By the way, last time when I made a live, you guys had questions and they didn't come through on the chat. So hopefully it's going to be working today. If you have got any questions, feel free to pop it into the chat box. But also when it comes to, Venus as the planet of self-worth, it means that the self-worth is really coming from our inner validation, right? Now, I often see with Venus retrograde that in early life, individuals with displacement often feel out of step with conventional dating rules and the society beauty standards. But as they grow up or mature, they realize their purpose is not to conform, to external models, of love, but to kind of like create this self-sustained sense of self-worth that should be becoming immune to external praise or even criticism as well. Venus represents finances and resource self-reliance or self-reliance. So, as just as their romantic values are self-derived, their financial habits often lean toward kind of like unconventional resource management or alternative revenue streams, or there could be a lot of focus on tangible values rather than kind of like these superficial status symbols. So, if Venus is the ruler of social harmony, so if Venus is directing your chart, that's often adapting to external social norms just to maintain the ease and the harmony. A Venus retrograde, remember, it's only 7 to 8 or 6 to 7% of the population. So it's going to be valuing more personal resonance over this kind of polite, superficial conformity. Venus is aesthetic and taste. So Venus direct often appreciates kind of like cultural trends, the current topics, right? Or I don't know, I'm going to go to the Nike shop because that's popular, right? A Venus retrograde is more vintage, more antique, more unconventional. Of course, I'm really generalizing it because we're going to have to look at what house your Venus falls into and what sign it is in, because those are going to be dictating further meanings to it. Venus is romantic bonding. So a Venus direct is going to be easier for her to express affection. And a Venus retrograde, unfortunately, the affection is felt deeply within, and it requires some a bit more internal processing before externally I'm going to put something on display. And with self-worth, Venus direct, yeah, that's going to be whenever Venus is retrograde, that external test or disruption can be felt a little bit more intensely. But if you were born with Venus retrograde, then you just kind of feel more at home. And potentially you might become even more clear-headed during the transiting Venus retrogrades. Okay? So now, like I said, Venus can be a morning star or an evening star in your chart as well. So that could be giving you kind of like additional meanings. So when you're analyzing, for example, a natal Venus retrograde, that the exact position of Venus relative to the sun determines whether it is operating as an evening star, that's the Hesperus, or a morning star, which is the Lucifer Venus. So how do we do that? Get your chart, check it. If Venus is at a higher zodiacal degree than the sun, it means that it sets after the sun in the evening. That would be representing a pretty much of a closing phase of the previous 584-day synodic cycle. So that means you have got an evening star. If you have Venus at a lower zodiacal degree than the sun, so it means that it rises before the sun at dawn, then you would have a morning star. So what does that mean? So if Venus is higher zodiacal degree than the sun, it means, let's say, sun is in Capricorn and Venus is in Aquarius, for example. Why? Because when I kind of like convert the degrees of the sign, when I convert the sign into degrees, let's say Capricorn is, 270 to 300 degree, right? Then Venus has got a higher degree there, right? So this is how you can determine whether you have got an evening star or a morning star, okay? So this is going to be giving quite a lot of differences in the interpretation as well, okay? Because if you have got an evening star Venus, that means that it's more to do with endings. So wrapping up things, closing things out. So from a relationship point of view, an evening star has got a bigger chance to close out the idea of being in a relationship, right? Or relationships can feel way more karmic, or often they are processing past bonds, and they are kind of like here to break old loops. I'm really focusing now on the retrograde meanings, okay? So if you have got a direct Venus in your chart, some of these descriptions are going to be relevant, but some of them are not, because I'm really talking about retrograde planets today. So I'm a little bit focusing on retrogrades, okay? Or if Venus is something to do with the aesthetics or values, an evening star Venus is going to become more nostalgic, vintage, classic, traditional, or re-evaluating values quite a lot. Venus, when it's evening star, it's a bit more reflective, cautious, holding back until kind of like it feels safe a little bit. Okay, so but the primary task or life path of Venus being an evening star in your chart is being retrograde, that you have to be releasing inherited cultural conditioning about love and worth. Now, if you've got a morning star Venus retrograde, then it's more to do with beginnings. It's more to do with rebirth, because it happened after the conjunction to the sun. Remember that a conjunction between, let's say, Sun and Venus is always, and then the Venus makes the conjunction to the Sun, it means it's going to go through a rebirth, right? So that Venus, if you've got a morning star Venus, then those are ready to potentially go into a new relationship, or they're ready to build up from scratch their relationship templates. That Venus is way more experimental, way more trend-defying. That Venus is way more non-traditional. That Venus is more to do with passion, and that Venus is ready to kind of go through some type of trials by fire. Of course, if your Venus is in, Capricorn, which is kind of like a protective sign, this is going to get kind of like taken down a notch, okay? So I'm really kind of like generalizing all of it. But the primary life task of Venus being a morning star would be that you have to be courageously asserting this self-invented identity and value standard without being reliant on external validations. So An evening star Venus is a bit more of the evaluator, okay? So it's processing the past, it's afraid of love because of past failures. Again, if it's retrograde in your chart, okay? It's more retrospective, right? Often those people spend their early lives kind of unpacking and looking at ancestral, familial, past relationship dynamics, and often they feel burdened by expectations as well. And that's why they are cautious. That's why it's kind of like more rare to kind of fall in love with someone kind of like instantly, or getting into a relationship in an impulsive way, right? There is that instinctual hesitation based on past experiences. If it's a morning star Venus, the Luciferian Venus, then that's more of a pioneer, more of a disruptor. So that's a bit more raw, unfiltered. So it means that you passed through the heart of the sun, right? So this Venus acts like an instinctual warrior of values. They don't wait to analyze, the past. They define beauty, passion, personal worth strictly on their own terms. Okay. And yet they are jumping into kind of like more risky situations because they are ready to go through a trial by fire, basically. So, how do we let me give you kind of like a bit of a delineation tip. So locate the sun's degree and the Venus degree in your chart. So if Venus is retrograde and is ahead of the sun in zodiacal order, let's say that the sun is at 10 degree Leo and Venus is at 18 degree Leo, it means you have got an evening star, okay? If Venus retrograde is behind the sun in zodiacal order, so sun at 10 degree Leo and Venus is at 2 degree Leo, it means you have got that more adventurous Venus. It's going to become a morning star, okay? So let me see if you guys have got any questions so far. Good evening. Well, I was not born with Mercury retrograde, but I don't feel trouble when Mercury goes retrograde. Also, my chart ruler Saturn is retrograde in the 11th house. What should sign of that be? So, like I said at the beginning of the video, Saturn goes retrograde approximately about 36 to 38% of the year. So instead of looking at it as a Saturn retrograde, just look at it as Saturn in the 11th house, such as stage fright, such as you are here to kind of like build up a online community, or this is about you just having few friends, for example, but those friends are going to be in your life forever. So therefore, I wouldn't necessarily be concentrating on that retrogression so much. Good morning, Canada. So one planet, which is Jupiter. So that's a great example. That's the 18 to 20% category there. It's kind of rarish. It's not that common, right? It would be more rare, of course, if it was Venus, for example, or Mars. Then that would be super rare. Jupiter, Neptune, and Chiron. So we don't count Chiron and Nodes and any other asteroids. Chiron goes retrograde also about 42% of the year. So it's very common too, okay? Now I'm talking about natal chart, not necessarily in progressions. In progress chart, it is very important period of time when the planet turns retrograde or goes direct. So of course you should be looking at it, but now from a just focus on your natal chart. I have a friend of mine. She was born with 0 retrograde planets. And around the age of 38 or so a good 10 years ago, 4 or 5 of her planets went retrograde by progression. Yes, unfortunately, her life kind of like collapsed quite significantly. So I would like to mention that. Because why? That person was used to moving towards the future. But all of a sudden, these progress planets kind of slowed her down to reevaluate her life, to kind of like revisit the past. So this was a period of time when she fell out with dad, and mom died, and all this type of really tragical kind of like moments. So and she is adjusting, of course, so it has gotten better and better, but the first few years were pretty difficult for her. Now, like I said, it's super rare if someone has got, for example, 6+ retrograde planets. Obviously, we are examining 8 planets, right? So having 6 is super rare. What did we say? It's approximately about 0.5% of the population, less than that, really. So, yeah, I can imagine those people are going to be looking at their life and thinking that their life is super doomed, or it's super difficult, or am I being cursed? These would be the questions of those natives. And I do not believe that their struggle in life is about the lack of ability. I think the friction for those people are going to be really coming from trying to live by standard societal clocks and expectations. I only have seen 2 or 3 of my clients with 6 retrograde planets. But let me tell you something. All those clients were looking after their parents, and all of them hated doing it because they wanted to do something with their lives. They kind of felt like that it was their obligation, and all of them told me that I hate it, but it's not because I don't love my parents. I just hate it that I have to put my life on pause. So often what happens with retrogression, that you have got this inner kind of like motivation to do something for others, but after a while it becomes kind of like a bit of a burden for you, right? So if you have got these 5, 6 retrogradations in your chart, it's a little bit like a mismatched clock, right? So you look at your time and then, oh, it's 5 p.m. And then the society tells you, no, it's 5:30. What is wrong with you? But these people don't look at the time kind of like through linear timelines, okay? Such as, society says, oh, you have to be graduated by the age of 22. You have to settle a career by age of 28, right? You have to be having a child by the age of, I don't know, 32, for example. So when you have got a chart with 5, 6 retrogrades, those people are reviewing their cycles non-stop. They go through this internal restructuring and course correction, and they might end up dropping out of school, for example. So most likely they are not going to graduate by the age of 22. They're not going to have a child by the age of 32, or whatever age we think we should have a child by. Okay. And of course, it can feel like a delay. It can feel like I'm being behind, or it can feel like that I'm going to get alienated from my peers, my family, if I don't get married by the age of 25, or I don't have a career by the age of 28. So often these people are going to have to learn to actually walk away from the expectations of the society, right? It means that there is a lot of over internalized processing happening, because the majority of the planets are planetary drives such as communication, love, value, drive, growth, are most likely retrograde. So it's all directed inward, right? So when it comes to an external decision, can kind of like trigger this internal reflection immediately. Often these people are super resistant to any type of conventional authority. Often these people don't feel that they fit in, actually. Okay? Because often I hear from these type of people that, a standard advice doesn't apply to them. Or often I see actually with these people that you tell them to do X and they will do Y instead. So somehow the standard protocol never works for these people. right? It is about them doing this independent testing. They have to fail, they have to deconstruct, they have to rebuild concepts to kind of truly understand where their life is going. But there is strength behind having so many retrogrades as well, because it gives you immunity to this mass hysteria, the collective trends. We people, the public, with kind of no retrogrades, for example, we are going to get easily swayed by these fads and opinions created on social media, these cultural panics, but those people kind of like walk away from those. you know, Charts with heavy retrogrades, often experience their kind of biggest breakthroughs after their first Saturn return, which is kind of like the post age of 30, or even later. And often they experience the breakthrough when these progress planets starts turning direct in their chart. Trust me, having too many retrograde planets is really difficult at the beginning of your life, but it is most likely bringing you a lot of success later on. That's my experience with them. Okay. And that's why these people can excel in research, deep psychological analysis, specialized in certain type of fields like craftsmanship, occult studies. That's why they are often entrepreneurs, for example. Any area where conventional thinking is kind of like a handicap and deep, um, they could be excelling at. Of course, when there is a messy transit, retrograde seasons happen, people with 5, 6 retrogrades barely flinch. That's kind of like my experience there. Now, what happens when a planet is retrograde, right? When a planet is retrograde, it revisits certain degrees multiple times. So basically, typically it's 3 times. Okay, it depends on the planet as well, because but all planets has got a free pass kind of like steps. Okay, so we've got the first pass when the planet is in direct motion, so it's moving forward over the degrees, encountering an experience for the first time, but it doesn't have the full context. Now we've got the second pass when the planet is retrograde, so it's hovering through the same degree the very first time, but the planet is moving backward over the exact same degrees. So it's often forcing a bit of a confrontation, what was missed, unresolved, unfinished, missing data, depending on the sign, right? And then we've got the third pass when the planet is again in direct motion. So that's going to be the final time, because if we have done the revision, then it's the integration of that new information that you gained, so that you have got a better understanding, you have got kind of like a genuine understanding over your life lessons, right? So what really happens is that, many people who have got retrogrades, kind of loads of retrogrades, they are living in the past, they are revisiting the past, they are working through the past, they are learning from their mistakes, and then therefore they become more cautious and reevaluate options, and often they are actually second guessing themselves as well. But the more retrograde you have, the more you have to revisit the past and resolve the loops there, right? Because the psyche is somehow hardwired to look back and instead of accepting an event at face value, there is that drive there to revisit past conversations, old connections, unfinished businesses, until that kind of like dynamic starts making any type of sense. you know if a direct planet, for example, makes a mistake, it often just moves on, even if the result was a bit sloppy. A retrograde planet is going to go back to the root cause of the problem to check the error. It's trying to dissect why it failed and tries to correct the mechanics, right? So I'm going to bring up again Venus as an example, but if you were born with Venus retrograde, you look at the relationships of your parents, your grandma, you start seeing certain type of patterns, and you become way more cautious in your romantic life. So now Venus is going to go retrograde very shortly in the sign of Scorpio. So, I want to mention a few bits and bobs, even though I'm going to be making a separate video about that. But, if, the very positive of Venus in Scorpio is, with even being retrograde, it's unflinching loyalty. And it's about the creation of an unbreakable bond once trust is earned. So maybe a Venus retrograde is going to force us to look at whether we have got that bond there, right? Venus retrograde in Scorpio can really talk to us about someone who is an instant lie detector, intuitively sensing hidden motives and emotional manipulation. I think those people have got natural talent for, uncovering assets or debt restructuring, or they have got a lot of talent in certain type of finance as well. And also another positive is that they have got resilience during emotional upheavals. Actually, they can thrive when fixing something that is broken, pretty much. And those people are often kind of like immune to these trends as well. The negative, let's call it as pitfalls, okay, or the potentials with Venus in Scorpio retrograde is that the deep-seated fear of betrayal. And what am I going to do? I'm going to be testing my partner secretly before opening up, right? Or it could be that we are reading malice and deceit into really innocent situations. So this can make us super suspicious, right? Or there could be a tendency to hoard resources or obsess over financial control, of course, out of survival fears. There could be a lot of reluctance, to let that dynamics go or kind of like vanish from your life. So you can be holding on to old grudges and past hurts and even toxic relationships. So therefore, these people are often a lot about self-criticism and they feel unlovable until that deep healing is happening. So Venus going retrograde in Scorpio, you're going to have to be able to decide by your natal Venus right now whether, you have done the positives or you haven't done the positives just yet. And if you need help with that, don't forget that I've got a 30% discount end of summer sale right now until 5th of September. So you can book a consultation with me. Just use the promo code at the checkout, buy summer all in capitals. Okay. So, if Venus is in Scorpio, there is some traps there, right? So it's kind of like the loyalty trap door. Because most likely those people expect betrayal and loss all the time. So they are kind of like looking for it. I want the partner to prove, their loyalty to me. And when we are digging deep, we are always going to find something there, right? Because everyone has got something to hide. Everyone has done something wrong before. So, by the way, where does retrograde come from? Now, the origin of retrograde is, well, first of all, let's look at the etymology, right? So retro means backward or behind, and gradus or grady means a step or to walk. So literally it means stepping backward or walking in reverse. Now in Roman astronomy, Latin writers use this phrase kind of like a motus retrogradus, which means a backward movement. And the very first time retrogression was pretty much documented was the first millennium BCE by the Babylonians. Those are the earliest kind of like written records of planetary retrogression. So ancient Mesopotamian astronomers they were outside, and they were tracking the nightly movements of the five, visible wanderers, because planet means wandering about. And obviously they were tracking them against the fixed stars, which we know that they are not fixed stars, right? So they noticed that the planets would travel east across the constellation, slow down to a standstill, which we call as the stationary point, and then travel west for several weeks or even months, right? And then pause again, and then kind of like coming backwards. And then they are kind of like resume that east kind of like journey again. Okay, so it comes from a bit of a Babylonian type of like story. Now the Greeks also came up with their own models. That was well, both of them tracked it in different ways. Okay, so for example, Plato challenged the Greek mathematicians about these movements, and he was kind of like against the retrogression. He couldn't kind of like imagine. Okay, but they started creating some mathematical models, and ancient astrologers were able to figure out on what day actually the planet is going to go retrograde. So it really goes back centuries ago. Okay, and then obviously Ptolemy, one of the biggest name, came around, and actually whatever Ptolemy said about retrograde planets were around for about 1,400 years until Copernicus showed up, because Copernicus noticed that this retrograde motion doesn't actually happen. It's an optical illusion caused by the Earth passing or being passed by, another planet. And ancient astrologers did know that this is going to be something to do with the movements of planets, but obviously they couldn't kind of like prove it just yet until Copernicus came around. Okay, so that's pretty much a little bit of a story about retrograde planets. I mean, we can really talk about retrograde planets for probably about a good 10 hours straight. But, well, I think it's more than enough information right now. So, does anyone have any questions at all on retrograde planets? At all? Because I'm seeing some messages, but I haven't seen any in the last half an hour or so. So I'm just wondering again if this is going to be something to do with the streaming device. Or can someone drop me a message in the chat box, just a question mark or something, so I can see that the messages do come through? Because I can see people are online, but maybe there is something wrong with it. Because I got an email from one of you the other day that, oh, Victor, we did ask questions in the chat box, but unfortunately you could not see them. And I'm just wondering if that's the case right now. And maybe it is, because I'm not seeing anyone dropping me a message. Okay, then. So thank you very much for being here. Then if you've got any questions, just drop it under the video. And then, I'm going to be monitoring the comments anyway, and then I will be able to kind of like give you some hints and tips there. If you're asking about your personal chart, usually I don't do that, because getting one position out of your chart, I don't necessarily give advice on that. I have to see the entire chart. So, but we have got the 30% end of summer promotion right now. So go ahead, just use the promo code BYSUMMER, all in capitals, at the checkout, and then we can have a consultation. Thank you very much for being here, everyone, and I will see you in my next podcast. Take care. Bye-bye.